The Mexican gray wolf spent 60 years being hunted to extinction by the same government that would later spend 50 years saving it. And right now, as its numbers finally climb, that same government is preparing the paperwork to strip away its protection again. This is the story of the Lobo, the smallest and southernmost gray wolf in North America. It might be the strangest relationship any government has ever had with a single species, because everything that's happened to this wolf, good and bad, came from the same hand. For thousands of years, the Lobo ranged across the deserts and pine forests of what's now Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico. It was smaller than its northern cousins, built for heat and hard country, and it did what wolves do. It hunted deer, it hunted elk, and when settlers stripped the land of that wild prey and filled it with cattle, it hunted cattle instead. That cattle depredation was the wolf's death sentence. Starting in 1915, the federal government made the extermination of the Lobo official policy. Not a side effect, not neglect. Policy. Wolves were shot, trapped, and poisoned by ranchers, by state agents, and by the same federal agency that would one day be charged with saving them. Bounties were paid for carcasses, and it worked with terrifying speed. By the early 1930s, the Mexican wolf was all but gone from the United States. One of the last was shot by a rancher in 1932, but the government wasn't finished. To make sure none wandered back, it stationed a hunter on the Mexican border, a man whose entire job was to kill any wolf that tried to walk north into America. Think about what that means. The elimination of an entire species wasn't the work of a few angry ranchers with rifles. It was an organized, funded, decades-long federal operation, and it was ruthlessly effective. By the 1930s, with America emptied of wolves, the government simply moved the campaign south. Starting in 1950, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pushed its extermination program across the border into Mexico, shipping government-made poison and sending its own people to teach Mexican ranchers how to use it. The same poisons that had cleared the American Southwest were now clearing the mountains of Sonora and Chihuahua, the Lobo's last refuge on Earth. For a while, it looked like nothing could survive it. The weapon of choice was a compound called 1080, sodium fluoroacetate, along with strychnine and steel traps laid across thousands of miles of wilderness. Poison doesn't kill cleanly, and it doesn't kill selectively. It killed wolves, but it also killed their pups, and the coyotes, the eagles, the bears, anything that fed on a laced carcass. An entire predator community was hollowed out to protect livestock. By 1970, the mission was essentially complete. The Mexican gray wolf was functionally extinct in the wild, north and south of the border. An animal that had walked this land for hundreds of thousands of years was down to a handful of survivors scattered across the remote Mexican Sierra. And here's the part that's almost impossible to believe. The very agency that had spent half a century perfecting the machinery of the Lobo's destruction, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was about to be handed the opposite assignment. Not because it changed its mind, but because the law changed underneath it. In 1973, Congress passed the Endangered Species Act, and overnight, the exterminator was ordered to become the savior. So the Fish and Wildlife Service went looking for wolves to save, and there were almost none left to find. Between 1977 and 1980, working with the Mexican government, biologists managed to capture just 5 wild Mexican wolves in the mountains of Mexico, 4 males and 1 pregnant female. That was it. That was the entire wild bloodline anyone could get their hands on. Those 5, combined with 2 wolves already in captivity, became the founders. 7 animals. Every single Mexican gray wolf alive in the wild today descends from those 7 survivors. For 20 years, the work happened quietly in breeding facilities operating under the Species Survival Plan, a coordinated program that paired wolves with the obsessive care of people trying to rebuild a species from almost nothing. Pups were born, tracked, and matched across facilities to preserve every last fragment of genetic variation. And then, on March 28, 1998, it finally happened. The first captive-raised Mexican wolves were loaded into crates, driven into the Blue Range along the Arizona and New Mexico border, the Gila National Forest and Apache National Forest at its heart, and released under what's formally called the Section 10J Non-Essential Experimental Population Rule, a legal designation that gave managers flexibility to handle conflicts while still bringing the wolf back. For the first time in decades, the Lobo's howl returned to the American wild. It did not go smoothly. Early wolves were shot, others were recaptured, and some years the population barely held. But slowly, the animals learned to be wild again, to hunt elk, to raise pups in the open, to hold territory. And then the numbers started to climb, and they didn't stop. In 2022, biologists counted 241 wolves. In 2023, 257. In 2024, 286. And in the most recent count conducted by the Interagency Field Team, the joint U.S.-Mexico body that runs the annual census, the wild population reached 319, the 10th straight year of growth, the longest unbroken recovery streak since the program began, from 7 wolves to more than 300. On paper, it's one of the great comebacks in American conservation history. It's a comeback that draws an obvious comparison to the Yellowstone wolf reintroduction, which restored gray wolves to the northern Rockies starting in 1995 and became the benchmark for large carnivore recovery in America. But where Yellowstone had hundreds of wolves to work with from healthy Canadian populations, the Lobo's reintroduction started with 7. That difference is everything. But that phrase, on paper, is doing a lot of work. Here's what the triumphant number hides. When you rebuild an entire species from 7 individuals, you don't just inherit their survival, you inherit their limits. Every wolf in the wild is now roughly as genetically related to the others as full siblings are. Biologists measure this with something called mean kinship, and in the wild population it sits at 0.24, where actual brothers and sisters measure 0.25. A population of 300 that is, genetically, almost a single family. That matters because inbreeding quietly erodes a species from the inside. Smaller litters, weaker pups, hidden defects. To fight it, biologists have used a technique called cross-fostering, slipping around 150 captive-born pups into wild dens, letting wild mothers raise them and carry fresh genes into the pool. It's clever, it's fragile, and many scientists argue it isn't nearly enough. So this is the true state of the Mexican wolf, growing in number, shrinking in genetic diversity, recovered on paper, and still deeply vulnerable underneath. Which brings us back to the strangest part of the whole story, because the government's role is about to flip one more time. In 2026, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, together with the Arizona and New Mexico wildlife agencies, announced it was preparing a petition to downlist the Mexican wolf from endangered to threatened, a step down in protection, pointing to those same rising numbers as proof of success. And running alongside that, in Congress, a bill from Arizona Representative Paul Gosar would go further still, stripping the wolf of federal protection entirely, and even forbidding a threatened listing. That bill has already cleared a House committee. Both paths lead to roughly the same place. Protection eases and management of the wolf shifts from the federal government to the states, which could open the door to legal hunting and trapping, and could slow or halt the genetic rescue work the population depends on. Supporters say the wolf has recovered and ranchers deserve relief from livestock losses. Opponents point at that kinship number and warn that pulling protection now, at the exact moment the genetics are most fragile, risks undoing 50 years of work. And so the Lobo arrives back where it started, its fate resting in the hands of the same institution that once tried to erase it. The government spent 60 years killing this wolf. It spent the next 50 rebuilding it from 7 survivors. And now it stands at a fork, deciding whether the job is finished or whether stepping back now means quietly letting the whole thing slip away. The Mexican gray wolf survived poison, bounties, and a hunter on the border. The question left is a simpler, harder one. Having brought it all the way back from the edge, will we actually let it stay?